All right. Welcome to biology. Let me just turn on my little red pen thing. All right. Today we're going to be talking about plant reproduction. And then I just have to find my other little thing. How do I switch slides here? There it is. Very, very small. All right. But before we go and talk about plant reproduction, just a review of some of the biochemistry we went over, which is difficult. Not gonna lie, but we're moving out of that, so that's good. But just as a reminder, so this is a functional group, and what a functional group is when we add certain combinations of atoms together, they bring on certain characteristics. And in this case, what we're looking at is we're looking at aspirin. And we can see that aspirin has a functional group of carboxylic acid and an ester. And so that just might help you out with some things. So those are the two functional groups of aspirin. So some plants reproduce by asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is like a cloning where like parts of the plant, if you think about it like leaves or stems and roots, actually become independent of the plant. So like in a couple of weeks, I'm probably going to go outside and take a shovel to my aloe plant because it overgrows and just split it. And when you split an aloe plant, the part you split off, you can actually plant in the ground, and that's how it becomes another aloe plant. So that's an example of asexual reproduction. So one of the things I do want you to consider and think about, because this might show up on some homework or test, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, is just what are some of the benefits and drawbacks to asexual reproduction? Now, there's also sexual reproduction. So it's a fusion of male cells in a pollen grain when we're talking about plants and female cells in the ovule. And so again, think about what are some of the advantages and drawbacks of sexual reproduction. All right, so haploid is a single set of chromosomes in each cell. A diploid has two sets of chromosomes in each cell. So normally we talk about like female cells or for female reproduction being XX and male cells being XY. Mitosis is when a cell just splits in half. And then you have two identical cells. And meiosis is when you have division of a cells, which produce haploid cells. And we'll go in a little more detail on that one because that one is a slightly more complicated than mitosis. So, the plant life cycle. So here's a handy dandy chart, just animals versus plants. So plant reproduction actually happens in alternation of generations. So this year versus, and then skip a year. And in this case, we're between generations. So we're skipping a generation and then starting on another one. Well, it's so professional with the yawn. So both have haploids. When there's spores, the spores are haploids in plants, and animals just don't have spores. As far as where you're getting kind of like your male contribution there, in plants, their haploid gametophyte, and that happens by mitosis, where in animals is diploid, and it happens by meiosis. And then spores, again, animals don't have spores. Spores are made by diploid sporophyte, which also happen by meiosis. And I know a bunch of fancy words out there, always Googleable. So, like I said, we're talking alternating generations. So plants have a double life cycle. Okay, so there's the sporophyte cycle, which is diploid, and the diploids produce haploid spores by meiosis. And then there's the gametophyte cycle, and that's going to have haploid cells, which produce gametes by mitosis. So some plants just don't flower, and flowers are generally how a plant reproduces. And these are going to include your mosses, your ferns, but they still have motile. Remember from a previous class, motile means moving, so it means fern. So what kind of environmental conditions would be required for reproduction in these plants? So just something to think about. And what kinds of limits do that? So what is the benefit and the negative consequence of this kind of reproduction? So this is the general life cycle of a moss. There's very complicated words on here, but we start off with this. And let's see, where should we start off? Let's start off on the gametophyte. So notice how we separated the life cycles. So we have the peristome, which sends out the spores, and then we get a rhizoid. So remember, mosses have rhizoids, very shallow roots. If we have a female gametophyte, which actually gets combines with the male gametophyte, and remember the motile sperm reaches the egg, we get a zygote. Now this is in the second life cycle, and in the zygote we get a young sporophyte, which becomes again essentially a moss. So this is the life cycle for a fern. So fern releases spores, it becomes a gametophyte. And then again, the haploids and diploids. So the blue arrows are going to represent where it's a haploid. And then the yellow will represent the diploid part of the life cycle. And then we have the transverse spores. So even when we have the zygote, becomes a young sporophyte, and then repeats the cycle all over again. So conifers are also non-flowering plants. But think of like pine cones. So the male gametophyte is contained in a dry pollen grain, which is inside the pine cone. And the female gametophyte is a few cells inside of the structure that become the seed. And that's how conifers reproduce. And so that we can see that on here. And this is a case of meiosis, where we have two separate male and female, which produce microspores. The female produces megaspores, where only one lives. They find a way, they come in contact with each other, and they produce a zygote, which is essentially the pine embryo. So conifers are wind pollinated. So I said they find each other. Their wind, kind of blows through the pine cones and sends everything out in the air. And some pollen land on the scales of female cones. Pollen germinates through a tube in the egg to allow the sperm to fertilize the egg. So again, think about what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to wind pollination. So flowers generally have something that goes between them to help them pollinate. Sometimes it's airborne, but a lot of times there's like a bee involved or an insect. So showy flowers are the results of efficient pollination strategies. So some reason, bugs like really beautiful flowers, and they're more attracted to them. And really, flower parts are modified leaves, and again, they're bright so that they attract the insects. So think about it again. Why would insects search for pollen? What other rewards do flowers offer? And again, what is the advantage and disadvantage of this process? So now we're going to talk a little more about flowers. So these are the flower parts, and you're probably most familiar with the petal, which is kind of the pretty flowery part. We have the sepal down here. The ovaries are down below, kind of between the stem and the flower. This part that sticks up is called the stigma. The lower part is called the style. These little parts that stick out, so like the part that goes up is called a filament, and like usually where the pollen is collected is the anther. And that makes up everything that's called the stamen. So flowers are complete if they have all the parts, and perfect if they have both male and female parts, because then they're very close to each other to catch the pollen and generate. Grass flowers are usually incomplete. They have a male and female and need somehow for that pollen to be transferred in between them. So tulip, if you think about it, is complete and considered perfect because they have both the male and female relatively close to each other so that they can fertilize, self-fertilize. And here's just a cross section of an imperfect flower. And so again, we can see a life cycle here for an angiosperm. So we have release of spores between two different sexes in a haploid form, eventually becoming diploid when they do produce and fertilize. And this is the example of the male when we're talking about flowers. And so usually have immature pollen grains, which are the sperm cells of the flower in the haploid form, into the pollen sacs where they become diploid. And this is the female. So we see the egg sacs with the ovaries and the release of the megaspores. So we see a high cycle in haploid, but we do see a bit in the diploid stage. And this is an example of double fertilization. So you can see here at the top, the pollen grain lands on the stigma. There's a pollen tube that grows down the style. And this is how it reaches the ovaries. And then you have one sperm that fuses with the central cell, and then one sperm which fuses with the egg cell. And that's what's known as a double fertilization. So this might mess with your head a little bit, but when you eat a fruit, so when a flower becomes pollinated, it produces a fruit. Some of these fruits we eat, some of these fruits we don't, but essentially you're eating the ovary when you're eating a fruit, right? So don't let that stick in your head too long. Just move along. And so the ovule becomes a seed. So when a fertilized ovule, it becomes a seed. And essentially the inside of the seed, so the seed's going to be a protective coating that's protecting the soon-to-be plant, the endosperm, inside until it's ready to develop. And so inside the seed, like the embryo starts developing like a little tiny plant. It'll start developing roots underground. It'll start emerging. And that's when it becomes its what we recognize as a plant. So before we wrap up here, as far as the plant life cycle, I just want you to know kind of like the general stuff. I know like on this last page, there was a lot of fancy wording. Just kind of know the general and really think about each type of plant reproduction and what is the advantage and disadvantage of each. So before we wrap up here, just a little more review on naming molecules from our biochemistry section. So again, functional groups are the specific groups that define a compound according to its properties. All right, so if you have a structure of alcohol, what might that structure be? And really methanol is the simplest molecule that has alcohol, so the oxygen hydroxide as a functional group. Sometimes we call this methyl alcohol. So what would we call a simple molecule containing an aromatic ring? Well, toluene, however you want to pronounce it, not going to fault you on that one, is the simplest molecule that has an aromatic ring. So is substituted on an aromatic hydrocarbon, having only one methyl group in the ring. And the structure for a simple molecule that has carboxylic acid, well, acetic acid is the simplest molecule that has that. So it has the carbon, double oxygen, hydrogen. And we also call this acetic acid. It's because it'll have two carbons and one carboxylic acid group. So if we have a simple molecule that has an amine group, methylamine is the simplest molecule to contain amine. And if the simplest molecule, a simple molecule containing both ketone and amine group is aminoacetone. And it has both ketone and amine functional groups in it, just like we were asking for. So simple molecule containing two double bonds is the 1,3 butadiene has two double bonds in the structure, and the double bonds are present at the first and third position, and di means two double bonds. So just a little review on naming molecules there. Hopefully it'll help you out. And again, on the reproduction, don't worry about the super fancy names. Just kind of get the process down in your heads and think about what are the benefits and the negative consequences of each methodology.